you talk a little bit about what that journey was like as you were going through the IT sysadmin type of role and growing in your career? And in particular, what was it like as a CIO and introducing open source into your company? And what era of time period of what, because that was an interesting time, and it was so common for IT, right, the sysadmins to be the ones who were bringing in open source, unbeknownst to the legal department or anybody else. It's like, here are utilities like Emacs, right, that I'm going to compile on my Apollo workstation. I'm assuming it was a workstation. But so can you talk a little bit about that journey and what that looked like as open source was being introduced to the companies? I expect probably through you, or as you were part of that process.
Yeah, I've introduced open source software in almost every job I was at. And so starting with that first one, I mean, the internship, then working for that company full time, Apollo was an old operating system, old platform, even by the time I got hired. It had been bought out by HP. They weren't selling Apollo systems anymore. So,
I worked at HP at the time, so I know that story.
So you kind of know. So yeah, most of our hardware was the Apollo line, which didn't exist anymore. And so it was just getting older as time went on, right? There were no patches, not that we were on the internet anyway, but and that made it kind of hard as a high tech company to try and do doing software development. Our developers were developing mapping software, custom mapping software. It was basically like what MapQuest became, eventually what Google Maps and Apple Maps and whatever else became, where you could do custom mapping, except it was more data oriented. And so, recognizing it's like, well, we don't have the funds. We're a small company. We don't really have the funds to go and replace everything wholesale. But we've got a lot of, PCs around the office, very powerful PCs. And one day I told my boss, I said, I want to run Linux on my computer at work. I run Linux at home. I want to run Linux on my computer at work. And my boss, she was very, very kind and said, yeah, you can do that. Here's a machine. You can set that up. And, here's your regular machine. But if you set up your Linux machine over here. And so I set up Linux on that machine and actually spent almost my entire day on the Linux box. It worked out really well. And then later when it's like, I want to improve how we manage our Unix systems, because we had a couple of Sun machines as well. And I can't install services. I don't want to install other services on the production systems. So let's set up another machine somewhere to run Yellow Pages, which is NIS, Network Information Systems. And so I'm going to do that by setting up a Linux machine. And so I set up a Linux machine in the network to run network information services. I set up another Linux machine to run storage. I set up another Linux machine to run backups. And so, my boss was very supportive of that and said, as long as everything is running well and you can get the job done and you're demonstrating you can recover from the backups and everything else, then this is great. And so it was kind of a way to kind of introduce this Linux concept into our office. I then changed companies to a company owned by a law firm that ran Linux in the back office there.
Right.
Then I worked for the University of Minnesota in 1998, and we were deploying our first web registration system. This was the first rewrite that everything was going to be web native. And we found that the IBM AIX systems we were running on, they actually couldn't support the load. they were just crushing when you get 700 students trying to register all at the same time. They're all clicking, submit at the same time. And it just could not survive the load. It was a Java-based application. And no matter what the developers did, we had IBM on the line. We had what was called a customer critical situation, which meant that vice presidents were aware of it. Nobody could figure out what was going on. And then suddenly, IBM said, well, we're offering now, customer support contracts. And so we will support your Red Hat Linux. This was before Red Hat Enterprise Linux. We'll support your Red Hat Linux. We'll support, we now provide IBM's Java for Linux. And so we'll support that as well. And IBM, the Java system that was running the application called WebSphere, we'll support that on Linux as well. And it's like, oh, great. We actually have one place that'll support everything. And so let's try, just to try, let's set up a Linux box and see if we can run the web registration system on it. And it smoked the AIX systems. The AIX systems were getting crushed at much less than 700. This machine was capable of, just one machine, not even load balanced, it was capable of supporting well over 700. And we're like, this doesn't make any sense, but it does. It runs really well. And we were getting really tired of the system crushing and being just falling over every time registration starts. And we were looking at going to another year, another cycle of it being falling over on the AIX systems. And I went to our CIO and I said, how about we have load balancing, so we got multiple machines. And so what if we just add some Linux machines in there? And the IBM machines still were falling over, but the Linux machines were doing great. And eventually we just replaced all of the IBM machines with Linux machines, and it was smooth and nothing ever fell down. And that was really our first use of Linux in the enterprise. By the way, we learned later, much later, that there was a problem with how Java, specifically on AIX, was handling, there's some sort of a locking situation. I don't remember exactly the details anymore, but it was only an AIX problem, which is why it was only happening on the AIX, and it didn't happen on Linux. And we ran Linux in the enterprise all throughout my time at the University of Minnesota. I went up the ladder and I became, eventually at that campus, I was a senior manager for enterprise IT operations and infrastructure. That is one title. It's really long. And it basically means the teams that reported under me ran all of the servers that supported the enterprise at the university. And so that meant storage, that meant backups, that meant disaster recovery, databases for all of our, everything, all the email systems, anything. If you were connecting to it, you were connecting to systems that my teams managed. And we replaced lots of systems running Linux, and that was entirely because we were slowly sort of discovering that Linux was very cheap, so it had a great cost benefit. It was enterprise supported. Red Hat eventually went to Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and so we were able to run these systems in a well supported, professionally supported way, but at a much lower cost. And I don't know that we ever modified source code, but it was nice that the vendors that we worked with, they some of them had said that they appreciated they could actually access source code to kind of see what was going on. Right. And so that was for us a very important thing, to be able to run Linux on enterprise. By the time I left that position to go on and become a CIO at a different campus, we had over 1,100 servers. And so it was probably like a 2/3, 1/3 distribution with Linux and Windows. You got some machines that some applications are going to only run on Windows, but everything else it ran on Linux. And so most of our Unix systems at that point were by that time were running on Linux. And so it was just kind of for me, just kind of something that made a lot of sense. I didn't push it as this is open source, we have to do open source. I pushed it as this is the best solution, right? So as a senior IT leader, you're kind of looking at this is the best solution for the organization. We're not doing it because it's cool. We're doing it because this is the right thing to do. And Linux just happens to be the right thing to do. And that's what we did.